In the last episode, I told you the Bible may have predicted exactly what the archaeologists would find. I want to make good on that today. For 100 years, scholars have looked at the dirt of the Promised Land and said the same thing. The archaeology disproves the Bible. Cultural continuity, no destruction layer, Israelite settlements that look identical to Canaanite ones. Therefore, they say, there was no Exodus, no conquest. The Old Testament is not history. I want to show you a verse that almost nobody on that side of the argument bothers to read. It is in Joshua chapter 13, the very book they say archaeology refutes. And once you see it, the entire archaeological case starts to look very different. Here's what the archaeologists actually found, and I want to be fair to them. I am not going to caricature their work. In 100 years of excavation across the land of Israel, Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Ai, Jericho, Shiloh, dozens of sites, they found four things that need to be reckoned with. 1. Cultural continuity. Early Israelite hill country settlements look very much like the Canaanite culture around them. Same pottery styles, same four-room house architecture, same agricultural patterns. 2. No widespread destruction layer. There is no archaeological signature of a sweeping military conquest in the late Bronze Age that lines up with a quick read of Joshua chapters 6 through 12. 3. Gradual emergence. Israelite identity does not appear suddenly. It develops over time, becoming clearly distinct only as you move into the period of the monarchy. 4. Material similarity. Take a pot from an early Israelite hill village and a pot from a contemporary Canaanite lowland site, and a layperson cannot tell them apart. The mainstream interpretation of this evidence has been simple, and from a secular vantage point, devastating. The Israelites were just Canaanites who developed a distinct identity over time. There was no Exodus. There was no conquest. The biblical narrative is a myth dressed up as history. If that is the case, I want to take it seriously. And then I want to show you what the standard interpretation has been overlooking for a century. Open your Bible to Deuteronomy chapter 7. Before Israel ever crossed the Jordan, God gave them their marching orders. And the orders were not go in and assimilate. The orders were the opposite. Deuteronomy 7, verses 2 to 5. When the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. Furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall tear down their altars and smash their sacred pillars and hew down their asherim and burn their graven images with fire. That is the standard on paper. Total destruction. No covenant, no intermarriage, tear down the altars, smash the pillars, cut down the sacred poles. Now hold on to that command, because what happens next is the key to this whole episode. Open one book over, Joshua chapter 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years when the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land remains to be possessed." Stop right there. The very book that critics use as a record of a sweeping conquest opens its second half by saying, very much of the land remains to be possessed. Joshua got old before the job was finished. Keep reading, Joshua 15:63. Now as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out. So the Jebusites live with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until this day. The leading tribe, Judah, could not drive out the original inhabitants of what would later become the capital of Israel. Jerusalem stayed Canaanite occupied throughout the period of the Judges. They lived together. Joshua 16:10. But they did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites live in the midst of Ephraim to this day, and they became forced laborers. Ephraim, the second most prominent tribe, failed at Gezer. The Canaanites stayed. They became laborers, but they stayed. Joshua 17, verses 12 and 13. But the sons of Manasseh could not take possession of these cities, because the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. It came about when the sons of Israel became strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. Manasseh failed too. 3 of the most prominent tribes, explicitly named in Joshua, failing to drive the Canaanites out of their territories. Now turn to the very next book, Judges, chapter 1. Judges 1 reads like a report card, and almost every grade is a failure. Verse 21, Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who live in Jerusalem. Verse 27, Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshean, Tanakh, Dor, Ebleam, or Megiddo. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites of Gezer. Verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or Nahalal. The Canaanites lived among them. Verses 31 and 32, Asher did not drive out the Phoenician cities. The Asherites lived among the Canaanites. Verse 33, Naphtali did not drive out Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath. They lived among the Canaanites. Verse 34, Then the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Tribe after tribe, failure after failure. The biblical record is unambiguous. Israel entered the land, took portions of it, but did not complete the conquest. They did not separate. They lived among the Canaanites. They intermarried with them. They eventually adopted some of their religious practices, which is what the entire prophetic tradition spends 800 years complaining about. And here is where it gets remarkable. Look at what God said would happen before they even crossed the Jordan. Deuteronomy 6, 10 and 11. Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. God told them in advance, you will inherit Canaanite cities, Canaanite houses, Canaanite cisterns, Canaanite vineyards, Canaanite olive trees. The infrastructure of the land you are about to take is already there. You will not be building them from scratch. You'll be moving in. Now hold all of that together. Deuteronomy 6, Joshua 13, Joshua 15, 16, 17, Judges 1, and tell me, what would you expect the archaeology to look like? If a people enter a land, partially conquer it, fail to drive out the original inhabitants, move into their cities, use their cisterns, harvest their vineyards, eat from their olive groves, and over generations intermarry with them, what is the material culture going to look like? It's going to look exactly like the original Canaanite material culture. The pottery is going to look Canaanite because they're using Canaanite pots. The houses are going to look Canaanite because they're living in Canaanite houses. The agricultural patterns are going to look Canaanite because they're working Canaanite fields with Canaanite tools. Cultural continuity is not a problem for the biblical narrative. Cultural continuity is what the biblical narrative explicitly predicts. Now, here is the second pillar of the argument, and this one cuts even deeper. If the secular reading is right, if Israelites were just Canaanites who developed a distinct identity over time and projected the conquest narrative back as religious mythology, then we have to explain something the secular reading cannot account for: the law itself. Open Leviticus, open Deuteronomy, read the legal sections, pay attention to what they prohibit and what they command. Canaanite religion was polytheistic, many gods, an entire pantheon led by El and Baal with Asherah, Anat, Mot. Go down the list. Levitical law commands strict monotheism. Strict monotheism in a sea of polytheism. That is not a small adjustment. That is a categorical rejection of the entire religious worldview surrounding them. Canaanite religion involved fertility cults and ritual sex at the high places. Levitical law prohibits all of it. Deuteronomy 23 explicitly forbids cult prostitution among Israel. Canaanite religion at certain levels involved child sacrifice, passing children through the fire to Molech. Leviticus 18:21 says, "You shall not give any of your offspring to offer them to Molech, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." And in Leviticus 20, the death penalty is prescribed for the practice, the strongest possible prohibition. Canaanite religion involved divination, mediums, sorcery, consulting the dead. In Leviticus 19, verses 26 and 31, "You shall not eat anything with the blood, nor practice divination or soothsaying. Do not turn to mediums or spiritists. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." Canaanites ate pigs. Pig bones are documented in the food refuse of Canaanite and Philistine sites. Leviticus 11:7, "And the pig, for though it divides the hoof, thus making a split hoof, it does not chew cud. It is unclean to you." And by the way, this is one of the few archaeologically detectable markers of distinct Israelite identity. When you find an Iron Age village with no pig bones in the food refuse, that is one of the clearest signs you're looking at an Israelite site, not a Philistine or Canaanite one. The law leaves a footprint. The footprint is small, but it is there. Sexual ethics. Canaanite practice included precisely the things Leviticus 18 lists as abominations and prescribes the death penalty for. The whole point of Leviticus 18 is that what the Canaanites did is the opposite of what Israel is supposed to do. And then there's the economic legislation, the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, the land lies fallow and debts are forgiven. The year of Jubilee. Every 50 years, the land returns to its original family. No interest on loans to fellow Israelites. Gleaning rights for the poor. The corners of the field do not belong to you. They belong to the widow, the orphan, the stranger. These are radically different from the surrounding cultures. They are also economically costly. So here's what the secular reading has to explain. If Israelites were just Canaanites who developed a distinct identity, why did they invent a religion that is precisely opposite to Canaanite religion at every point that matters? Why would Canaanites reject polytheism for strict monotheism, when polytheism was the universal practice of every ancient Near Eastern culture? Why would they prohibit fertility cults that were tied to agricultural success in their own economy? Why would they forbid child sacrifice on penalty of death when surrounding cultures treated it as the highest form of devotion to one's gods? Why would they outlaw divination and mediums when those were the standard tools of spiritual life across the region? Why would they refuse to eat pork when pork was the normal part of the Canaanite diet? Why would they adopt economic laws that cost them Sabbath year, Jubilee, no interest, gleaning, when surrounding cultures had no such restrictions? Why would they claim to be descended from a man who was a stranger from Mesopotamia, who lived as a tent dweller, never built a city, and had to buy a burial plot at full price? And why would they claim that their nation began in slavery in a foreign country, which is the most embarrassing possible origin story for a nation to invent? None of these are natural developments out of Canaanite culture. Every one of them runs against the cultural grain. The whole structure of the law looks like the work of someone who is deliberately separating a people from the culture they are embedded in. And here is the key. That is exactly what the biblical narrative says happened. Moses brought down the law at Sinai precisely because the people coming out of Egypt would not be culturally separated from the land they were entering. The law was the separator. It is what makes Israel Israel, not their pottery, not their houses, not their architecture, but their dietary code, their sexual ethics, their treatment of the poor, their refusal of polytheism, their rejection of fertility cults, their prohibition of child sacrifice. You can take a Canaanite pot and an Israelite pot and not tell the difference. You cannot take a Canaanite religion and an Israelite religion and confuse them for a single second. The material culture is similar, exactly as the biblical record predicts, since they were living among Canaanites in Canaanite houses. The legal and religious culture is radically distinct, exactly as the biblical record claims, since the law came from outside the cultural matrix at Sinai. Now, I do want to be honest here and handle some objections. Objection 1. The Levitical laws were composed during the Babylonian exile and projected backwards in time. This is the standard scholarly response. The law, as we have it, they say, was put together during or after the exile, and the priestly writers retrojected it onto Mosaic origins to give it authority. There are real problems with this. First, large portions of the law presuppose a settled agricultural society in the land. The Sabbath year requires you to have land to let life follow. The Jubilee requires generational land holdings. The gleaning laws require harvest fields. The pilgrimage festivals require a temple in Jerusalem. None of this is operable during exile in Babylon. Exiles writing in Babylon would have no practical reason to invent such a system and no machinery to implement it. Second, the law contains archaic legal forms that fit better with 2nd millennium BC treaty conventions than with 6th century literary forms. The covenant structure of Deuteronomy mirrors Hittite vassal treaties from the late Bronze Age, the Sinai era, not Persian period legal documents. Kenneth Kitchen, the Egyptologist at the University of Liverpool, has documented this in detail across decades of work. Third, the prophets who lived before the exile treat the law as already established and ancient. Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, they appeal to the law as a covenant Israel has already broken. They do not present themselves as innovators, creating something new. They present themselves as covenant prosecutors, holding Israel accountable to a law everyone in their audience already accepts as binding. Fourth, the embarrassing features of the narrative argue against late composition. Late writers inventing a glorious past would not invent slavery in Egypt, the Golden Calf Rebellion, generations of failure, repeated apostasy, and a national history that ends in defeat and exile. That is not how you invent a flattering myth. That is how you preserve an honest history that you wish were not true. Objection 2. This is special pleading. You're reading the Bible to fit the archaeology. I understand that objection, so let me be precise about what is actually happening here. I am not reading the Bible to fit archaeology. I am reading the Bible on its own terms, using the standard rules of biblical interpretation any seminary student learns in his first year. And I am noticing that the Bible itself describes a scenario in which the archaeological evidence makes sense. The text was sitting there for 3,000 years before any modern archaeologist picked up a trowel. Genesis 13:1 was written long before Hazor was excavated. Judges 1 was canonized long before anyone debated material culture. The biblical narrative was not adjusted to fit 20th century archaeology. It was written, and then 20th century archaeology found exactly what a careful reader of Joshua and Judges would have predicted. Special pleading is when you twist the text to escape evidence. Honest reading is when you take the text seriously and discover that the evidence and the text were never as far apart as you were told. Objection 3. Even if all this is right, you still need the Exodus to be historical. That's correct, and I'm not trying to dodge it. The argument I'm making today does not prove the Exodus happened. It proves that if the Exodus happened, even on a smaller scale than the maximal reading suggests, the archaeological record we actually have is exactly what we would expect. The Exodus is a separate question. I touched parts of it in episode 3, and I will return to it next week in episode 6, where we deal with the numbers, the camels, the Philistines, the Egyptian silence, and the documentary hypothesis, one objection at a time. The argument here is narrower, and I think stronger because of it. Two things stand together: a biblical narrative that explicitly predicts cultural continuity, and a law that requires an external origin to make any cultural sense at all. You cannot get the law of Moses out of Canaanite culture. The law is the fingerprint of an external lawgiver, and the people who carry that law are precisely the people who, by their own admission in their own scriptures, did not separate from the Canaanites the way they were told to. So, what do we do with all this? First, stop letting people tell you that archaeology has disproved the Bible. It has not. What archaeology has found in the land of Israel is exactly what a careful reading of Joshua and Judges predicts: cultural continuity between Canaanites and early Israelites. No widespread destruction layer, gradual emergence of a distinct Israelite identity. The text and the evidence are not opposed. They've been telling the same story all along, but the text was telling it for 3,000 years, and almost nobody on the academic side of the debate had bothered to read past chapter 12 of Joshua. Second, pay attention to what makes Israel actually distinct. It was never the pottery. It was never the architecture. It was the law, the dietary code, the sexual ethics, the treatment of the poor, the refusal of polytheism, the rejection of fertility cults and child sacrifice, the covenantal structure that ordered the entire society around the worship of the one true God. That is the lesson, and it carries directly into where this whole series is going. What makes the people of God is never the externals. It is never the architecture or the pottery or the political boundaries or the genetic descent in isolation. It is always the covenant. It is always the law that points to Christ. It is always the worship that comes from a heart shaped by the God who acts in history. Third, be careful with what this opens up. The synthesis I am offering today does not prove every detail of the biblical narrative. It does not solve the problem of the large numbers in Exodus. It does not prove that every battle described in Joshua happened exactly as written. It opens a door the secular consensus has been telling Christians for 100 years was permanently shut. What I want you to walk away with is this: the door is not shut. The text and the evidence are not enemies. The honest reading of the Bible and the honest reading of the archaeological record are pointing in the same direction. And if that is true at the level of pottery and pillars and pig bones, it can be true at the level of patriarchs and prophets and resurrection too. Now, we have just turned the corner. For 4 episodes, we asked the hard questions. Today, we got our first answer, and it came from the biblical text itself. But there are more objections still on the table. There's the question of the numbers: 600,000 fighting men, besides women and children. 2 to 3 million people walking out of Egypt and leaving no archaeological trace. Is that even what the Hebrew is saying? There's the question of the camels. Were they domesticated in Abraham's time, or is Genesis dropping in an anachronism? There's the question of the Philistines, who appear in Genesis, where some scholars say they should not be. There is the question of why Egypt's records are silent on a slave population's escape. In the next episode, we're going to take those objections one at a time, honestly. Some of them are weaker than the critics make them sound. Some of them are real. I'm going to tell you which is which, and show you that the same kind of careful reading that opened the door today opens more doors than you might expect. We are not done with the synthesis arc. We've only just begun it. Stay with me.